Good evening, everyone, to the panel, The New Global Disorder, the Crisis of Liberal Internationalism and Its Consequences. I want to begin with the all-important land acknowledgement, which is that this panel is taking place in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik peoples first signed with the British in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We are all treaty people. My name is Nancy Forestell. Some of you may be wondering what I'm doing up here, but I teach in women's and gender studies and in history, and I am the coordinator this year of the development studies program. I kind of get around, as it were. This evening, and we have a powerhouse panel. I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. They all understand that they have around 10 minutes, and that I'll let them know when they're getting close to their time. And then after each of the panelists do their presentation, we'll have questions, okay? So to begin with, Dr. Asa McKercher is the Stephen K. Hudson Chair in Canadian-U.S. Relations at the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government at St. FX, a specialist on American politics and on the Canadian-American relationship. His latest books include Building a Special Relationship, Canada-U.S. Relations in the Eisenhower Era, 1953 to 1961, and North of America, Canadians and the American Century. Next is Yogesh Ghore, who is a senior program staff person at the Coady Institute. He leads the Coady Institute's Inclusive Economies thematic area, drawing on over 23 years of global experience in community and international development. As a dedicated practitioner and educator, he provides leadership for a wide range of educational programs, research, and capacity building initiatives. His work spans Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Americas, with a current focus on social enterprise, the formal economy, or I should say the informal economy, the future of work, and building a joint transition toward a green and inclusive economy. Next up is Dr. Hailey Murphy in the Department of Political Science. She holds a PhD from York University, specializing in Canadian politics and the politics of the 2S LGBTQ plus community. Her research focuses on lesbian political autonomy, intersectionality, queer rights, particularly political invisibility and the need for recognition. A proud member of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, she connects the needs of her community with her academic work. Next is Dr. John Langdon, the Canadian Research Chair for Sustainability and Social Change Leadership here at St. FX. He teaches in the Development Studies program and in adult education. For the last 20 years, he has been working with social movements in Ghana to document and deepen their learning in, through, and to struggle. More recently, this work sparked a partnership network amongst social movements in Ghana, South Africa, Guatemala, and Canada that focus on how movements can learn from each other from one locale to another or translocally. He has co-authored many publications throughout his career, including, and most recently, he's the author of African Social Movements Learning and editor of Indigenous Knowledges, Development, and Education. And last but not least, and I do say that, last but not least, Dr. Lavinia Stan, who is the inaugural Victor Philip Delay Chair in Democracy and Governance, and a Mulroney Institute Fellow, as well as a Professor of Political Science here at St. FX. She is a comparative politics specialist, widely recognized as an expert on Romania and the post-communist world. Her recent work has focused on the way in which religious groups have reckoned or not with their communist past and with their involvement with those repressive regimes. She's the author or editor of some 15 books and numerous articles and book chapters, including Post-Communist Progress and Stagnation at 35, The Case of Romania, and the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Transnational Justice. I think it should be well evident how well qualified our panelists are to address the issue this evening. So without further ado, I will ask Asa McKercher to speak first.
Sure. Thanks, Nancy. And thank you all for being here today, particularly as there's another competing event, I think, whatever it is. Anyway, you've chosen the better option. I'll be in. I'm speaking, I think, on this panel as the historian and giving a historical perspective. I think that's my brief. And I'll start with the views not of an historian, but of the French philosopher Voltaire, who once quipped that the Holy Roman Empire was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. And historians have very much objected to that characterization because it was all three. And I think we could make the same quip, in a sense, about the liberal international order, whether it was liberal, international, or an order. And I'd say it was. And certainly from a historical perspective, those things are true. And over the trajectory, the reasons, or those sort of three adjectives, I guess, to describe it, are they adjectives? I suppose they are partly the reasons why the liberal international order was not perfect. And I think there's a tendency, of course, to not to have the perfect be the enemy of the good. And in some ways, why the liberal international order is something that just couldn't last. And I think we're seeing the end of that right now. So in terms of the liberal aspect, and I think Dr. Murphy will talk later about liberal internationalism and Immanuel Kant and things, but in terms of the liberal aspect, the liberal international order was born out of the Second World War and was born out of the victory of liberalism in that contest against the fascist powers. It was very much the product then of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the greatest American president in my view, who very much wanted to build a liberal order with the United States at its center, but with other countries a part of this liberal network of organizations centered around the United Nations. And obviously what occurs then over the next few years after the creation of the liberal international order, with the United Nations again as its foundation block, is the contest then between liberalism in a big sense and communism. And so that kind of clash at the naissance, the birth of the liberal international really shapes the way that it unfolds, in the sense that for the first 40 years or so of the liberal international, there's a clash in a very ideological sense, but also a military sense and an economic sense, etc., between the liberal world, the West, if you like, and the illiberal world led by the Soviet Union. And that's, of course, gives rise then to liberal international organizations, the United Nations most prominently, as battlefields in this contest between liberalism and illiberalism. And while the United States and its allies, Canada included, were major backers of liberal international organizations, again, the United Nations, then its subsidiary organizations, the World Health Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, UNRWA, and all these various kind of organizations that it funded, it did so partly for the contest of hearts and minds across the world. And some of the problems then, of course, that occurred in the sort of hypocrisy, I suppose we might say, certainly what the Soviets would say, of course, liberal countries, the United States most famously, of course, intervening to fight illiberalism across the vast swath of the kind of global chessboard, really undermined some of the principles of liberal internationalism, whether it's the Americans intervening in South Vietnam or Chile or other Cuba or other places. But at the end of the day, the United States was committed to pushing a liberal worldview that, for all its problems, also had great successes. And of course, part of the liberal ethos was to help those who couldn't help themselves. And so many of the liberal international organizations set up under the United Nations banner, and again, pushed and largely funded by the United States and its allies, were meant to help people in the third world, as it was called throughout the Cold War. And to do their best to, again, partly to win hearts and minds of the Cold War contest, but also to do what Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the framers of the liberal world order wanted to do, which was to avoid the situation of the 1930s, the global deprivation and the sense that when people are starving, when people are out of work, when people's countries are in midst of collapse, they turn to some of the worst ideas, whether it's communism or fascism, etc. And so better to promote kind of liberal values. But as I think particularly Dr. Murphy might notice or might point out, the problem with liberals is they don't like to, they don't like equality necessarily. And so part of the problems with liberals too is that, and liberal organizations, is that of course weren't going to overly tax taxpayers in the global north to the benefit of people in the global south. There's limits to liberalism. Certainly that would be one of the critiques of socialists, certainly of the Soviet Union, etc. If we move then to the international part of the liberal international order, it was very much an international system. The United Nations, as part of the bedrock of the UN Charter, assumes a world of sovereign states, sovereign nation states of some sort, interacting with one another. And that's not to deny the importance of transnational movements and other kinds of things, but at the big formulation of the international order is that it's a system of states, and that state sovereignty and state rights are the paramount prime sort of movers, if you like. And of course, when countries then gained their independence, one of the big developments, of course, in the not just the Cold War after 1945, but was the global end of formal empire, particularly European empires, across the world, is that people wanted their own nation states. And so one of the big developments that occurs from 1945 onwards is the devolution of empire and the entry into the United Nations and in effect the international system of dozens, if not hundreds actually, of states. And of course, which states form then becomes its own sort of source of conflict. Who gets to rule those states and who doesn't get a state becomes a major issue after 1945. And we only need to think of Israel and Palestine or Biafra and Nigeria, or East Pakistan, Bangladesh, as it is now, to think of some of the states, some of the peoples who didn't get independence and then eventually did or did not, as a case, for instance, of Biafra might be. But that desire to join the liberal international system is something that many people have fought and died for and wanted to have. That international recognition provided by membership in the United Nations is something, again, that many people have been motivated to search for. So there's some value, in effect, in the liberal international system. But as we've seen in instances of genocide, whether it's the situation in Rwanda in the 1990s or the collapse of Somalia or more recent sort of issues, is obviously the part of the international system is, again, the concept of sovereignty, and that what goes on within a nation state is the business of that nation state alone. And so what that's meant is, despite the principles of liberal internationalism and the desire to prevent a rerun of the horrors of the Second World War that occurred during the Second World War, the international community has been sort of handicapped, if you like, by handcuffed, I should say, sorry, by the principles that are fundamental to the international system, which is, again, the kind of sovereignty of inequality in theory of states. And so that is one of the things I think that's made many people sort of, certainly my students, often shake their heads at the international concept of the international order, is that there's plenty of conflicts that have occurred. But most of those conflicts have been internal sort of horrors, internal kind of conflicts, states collapsing. One of the kind of hallmarks since 1945 is really the lack of major and even really lots of minor state-to-state kind of conflicts. And so the liberal international order has been a relatively ordered period in world history. There have been certainly conflicts, and there certainly have been conflicts between states, but they've been, relatively as a overall number small and compared to sort of global history in many other periods of history. It's certainly European history in the early 20th century and the 19th century. And what we certainly haven't had is a world war of the equivalent of what ended in 1945. We haven't had a major great power conflict, thank God, because of course of the other development that perhaps is one of the reasons why the liberal international order was so ordered, is that of course we live under a world of nuclear weapons. And one of the reasons perhaps we've avoided a great power war is we could take a very positive view and say it is that the international order is an ordered system in which states are respecting their rights, etc. Or it's because of the potential for nuclear holocaust that could be waged by the various great powers on each other and anyone who they oppose. But I take it as a positive thing that there hasn't indeed been a major great power war since 1945, and that the liberal international order has been ordered in the sense that countries have more or less abided by the UN Charter's sort of underlying principle that one shouldn't wage wars of territorial conquest against one's enemy. And certainly we're seeing, or against an opposing country. And certainly we're seeing that be tested now in various places around the globe, perhaps most obviously between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, one of the guarantors of this order was the United Nations, but behind it was its major guarantor, the United States, which set up the United Nations. And was the major enforcer of this kind of concept. And maybe you'll, want to throw tomatoes at me or something. But obviously the the United States, has put its money where its mouth is in terms of enforcing this idea of global order in the Korean Peninsula in 1950. Then the Cold War sort of became a bit of a problem. But then again, in the kind of so-called New World Order proclaimed by President George H.W. Bush with the situation in Iraq and Kuwait in 1990-1991. But the seeds of that global order enforced by the United States had its own there were limits to what the burden, I guess, the United States was willing to bear. And so the seeds of the undermining of the global order were set in the fact that many Americans did not want to be the world's policemen. And so there was a reaction, for instance, to the actions of George H.W. Bush in the 1990s. And that sort of drumbeat of isolationism in the United States, which was always there from 1945, but was muted, and there was essentially a bipartisan consensus that the United States should support the liberal international order. That drumbeat became increasingly loud and became then a cacophony in 2015, 2016 with the emergence of the America First movement. And just to sort of conclude, obviously, it's that that very name America First was the name of the people who opposed essentially the United States stepping into the world in the 1940s and undertaking this rule to make the world a better place. The America First movement of the 1940s is very similar to the America First movement of our current era, and that it doesn't believe in the United States going abroad to do these sorts of things. So I probably spoke too long and maybe rambled a bit, but there's room perhaps to challenge me if you'd like in the questions and answer period. But I'll just close with the wise words of one Jay Mitchell, who said, "Don't you always seem to go? You don't know what you got till it's gone." So thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you, Nancy, and thanks, Asa, for a great start. This is a huge topic, humongous. So in order for us to actually cover some ground and speak from a frame, so let me involve everybody in this, and let me start with an analogy of this global, liberal international order. So let me start with an analogy of a tree. If we consider this new liberal international order as a tree, I want a show of hand. How many of you think that this tree, and as you were saying, this tree has been actually pulled out and there is no chance of it to survive? 2 people. Okay.
I'll point out they're both historians. We're very cynical people. 3 historians. There we go.
Now raise your hand if you feel that all he talked about was just a noise and all what we hear about this crisis of this to this new disorder, it's just a big noise and nonsense, and everything will be fine. If you feel that, please raise your hand. So nobody feels like that. Now, raise your hand if you feel that there's been some very strong pruning has been done to its branches, and there is no way after that heavy pruning and pulling that the tree is going to survive. Nobody, or you feel that way. Okay, 2. Now, how many of you feel that, okay, yeah, heavy pruning has been done, it's been branches have been pulled out, but if we change the gardener, maybe the tree will come back, maybe it will flourish again? Many. Okay, so you have the answer, Nancy, maybe to begin with. Now, in order for us to do that, it's important that we actually examine the branches. So let me start with 2, 3 of the aspects of these branches and see where we are. And I'm not going to repeat a lot of the history. I think you covered it really well. So let me start with where you talked about the rules-based international order and all the institutions of global governance that were created after the World War II, starting with the United Nations and all its specialized agencies, the World Bank, IMF, WTO. And for a period, as you argued, that it served the purpose. I mean, it prevented us from the World War III. It, for as you were saying, for a major part, there was peace, or you can say the conflicts were outsourced, and they were not centered around those powers. And for a greater part, there was some progress made. Now it feels as if all those institutions are under fire. Now, if we look at this, if these institutions were created in 1945 until now, almost 80 years, some changes were in order. There were a lot of room for improvement. And now if those changes are made, and as you said, there was a lot of leadership provided by the United States, and the institutions are as good as their leaders. So if the leadership changes, then maybe a part of these rules-based international order may come back. Now, let me look at the second, another branch, which is the unwinding of the globalization agenda. So we know with all that after the World War II, and more intensively, I would say, after the end of the Cold War in 1990s, we saw a very rapid, with a lot of pace and intensity of globalization, the movement of goods, services, and people, if you want to simplify that. Now that continued, and that continued for that period between 1990 and you can say up to 2010 or up to COVID, very intensive globalization that we saw. Now we feel that there is a sharp U-turn in that, and COVID was a big turning point where all the countries started to look inward and started to look at their own supply chains and bringing the production back home countries. And so there was a lot of talks now that are we in the phase of deglobalization now? But if you really look at it, those 3 things: goods, services, and people. If goods are produced, they will find their market. So now even in today's scenario, if you see, there's just one country that is creating tariffs and that is saying no to that movement of goods. But in response, what has happened, and that was true during the COVID as well, that there was reconfiguration of the supply chains. There was a reconfiguration of how the business is done. So rather than all the roads leading to Washington, they may lead to Beijing, they may lead to Delhi, they may lead to Johannesburg, or they may lead to Halifax. So there's a strong reconfiguration of those global supply chains and globalization, and particularly those goods and services will find markets. The problem I feel is the movement of people. And with the strong anti-immigrant policy in the US, and also you feel the strong anti-immigrant wave bubbling across Europe, what we saw recently in UK. So there is the sentiment that movement of people will be restricted, and what we hope that the globalization will do will enable the movement of people that is getting affected. But there as well, recently, US announced that H-1B visa restriction and $100,000 fee. The response to that from China is that they have started an equivalent of H-1B, where they are going to invite, they are calling it technological challenges, to fellows to come and be in China. And so they will now give H-1B visa. So there will be reconfiguration on that aspect as well. Now, the third branch, I think, and that's very critical, and you spoke a lot on that one, is on the geopolitical competition. So I'm not going to repeat the history of that bipolar world, and then after the Cold War, 1990, to this period of what you can say unipolar world, where one country, United States, dominated economically, politically, militarily, technologically. In all those domains, they were one power that remained uncontested. That continued from, you can say, 1990 with very intensively up to 2010. And then what we saw in 2008 with the subprime crisis and with the Lehman Brothers and all, that in all that crisis, there was one country that was not affected, and that was China. So you saw the rise of China during that period. And also, and that started to challenge the power in all those domains. But at the same time, there was this rise of others as well. And it was just not China. And when I say the rise of the others, these are so-called emerging economies, India, Brazil, South Africa. So you saw that as well during that period of time. And they essentially were not anti-West, they were non-West. And if you look at some of those countries, and they are called the Global South, which has now become a term of art. Global South is just not least developed or developing economies. These are countries which have emerging economies. They are very youthful. The population of youth is far more as opposed to the aging North. And they have aspirations. They are innovators. So they are actually challenging in their own way to that geopolitical order. And in doing so, there are new configurations coming up. So, for example, we have, and this is not new, this is long. We have something called RIC, Russia, India, China. There is a grouping. And then you add Brazil and South Africa, there's something called BRICS, these 5 economies. And now they have added 6 more countries into that: Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, UAE, Saudi Arabia. These 11 countries are called BRICS Plus. And to give you a context, their economies, their GDP is 40% of the global GDP, as opposed to 25%, which is the G7, which is no longer the top global economies in the world. So that is going to cause a lot of shift, and that I think is something that we really have to pay attention to in terms of the global order. And finally, I would like to say, and this is where I pay a lot of attention, Coady Institute pays a lot of attention, is this whole area of international development assistance and what has happened there. So if you see, going back to the history, you can actually trace back the history of international development to that period of 1945. All these major organizations, whether CARE, Oxfam, they were all created during that period of time. Now, what has happened with the overnight evaporation of USAID funding, there are challenges. Absolutely, because USAID funding used to go to more than 100 countries. So all the funding that used to go there, that is affected. But it's just not US. The Japanese have done it. The UK has done it. The Australians have done it. Many countries in the European Union have done it, and European Union as a whole have done it. So there is absolutely a lot of sort of reduction in international development assistance. Now, there as well, I would say, if you look at what is happening, and this is where when I travel across the world, I find out that there is a response to that as well. This whole localization agenda and support for local movements, local work is coming up. We at the Coady Institute, we used to get funding from the federal government. In 2015, we got a major funding from the government. 50% of that directly goes to our partners in the global south. And that is increasingly the trend now for major programs. So there is a lot of new creative ways how to respond. So there's like corporate social responsibility funding. The organizations are getting leaner. There are social enterprises and a lot more innovation and entrepreneurship that is happening locally. Now, so to me, I think we shouldn't be like what you call chicken little syndrome. We shouldn't be suffering with that, because I think the sky is not falling. Maybe with the change in leadership, things will change. But what worries me the most, and that's where I'll end, Nancy, is that this kind of discussion of liberal international order and crisis shouldn't distract us from the real issues on the ground. So when I go and talk to a woman farmer in Gujarat and how she's dealing with the crisis of climate change, I'm off to Peru in a week, and when I go and talk to the farmers sitting on a cocoa farm, and the farmers tell that how worried they are in terms of the commodity price fluctuation and how much money they will make from their cocoa. And similarly, when I go and talk to indigenous person in Saugeen and how they want to take their rights to livelihood in fishing, they all tell us one thing, that it's those day-to-day issue, whether it's the climate, whether it's the rising unemployment, their economic opportunities. Those issues are real, and I think we shouldn't take these big discussions shouldn't take away from those real issues on the ground.
Thank you. I think going off of your tree analogy, my contribution is going to kind of take that and say, perhaps it's not the person pruning the tree that's the problem, but perhaps we're at a place that is almost predictable and a symptom of the species of the tree itself. In my view, the tree is liberalism. So I'm going to do a little bit more of a theoretical talk about liberalism in general, and then go through the trajectory kind of how this looks when it is implemented. So when we talk about liberal international order, we're talking about crisis. And on one hand, we see an intensifying threat from illiberal forces, leaders like Donald Trump and others across the world, who are actively dismantling institutions that have structured the global system since 1945. On the other hand, we also have to confront a more uncomfortable truth, that many of the same institutions have been, from their inception, deeply complicit in economic domination, neocolonialism, and the reproduction of global inequality. The liberal institutional order emerged from the Enlightenment conviction that reason could discipline power. Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace imagined that peace among states might be secured through law and republican government rather than domination or moral virtue. He warned against a moral politician who would corrupt politics through their sentiments, and instead favored a political moralist who would derive duty from reason and also from the law. For Kant, a just state could be built even from a nation of devils, so long as the institutions of that state compelled rational actors to act as if they were moral. This idea that good governance does not require good people, only sound design, became the philosophical core of liberalism's political vision. Liberal institutionalism translated that vision into international relations, and its adherents believed that rational, rules-based cooperation could mitigate anarchy and also sustain peace. Yet realism, and then later neo-realism, challenged this type of optimism. And neo-realists argued that institutions have no independent moral force, which is assumed in liberalism, and that they merely reflect the power of the states that create them. States, they said, the realists that is, pursue relative gains, not collective good, and will defect from cooperation when it's no longer in their interest. Institutions are thus weak, costly to maintain, and fundamentally derivative of power. Liberal internationalists respond by moderating their expectations. Many conceded that institutions could not transform state behavior wholesale, but argued that they mattered under specific conditions for when states shared interests and when mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement also existed. Thus, they accepted the realist premise of self-help, but retained faith in the institutional design as a way to align interests and manage interdependence. But after 1945, these ideas were embedded in the architecture of the post-war order. But the development of this order carried what I would argue a moral cost. Its modernization theories assumed that institutions were transferable instruments of progress, meaning that developing states could emulate industrialized democracies through liberal economic reform. In practice, this produced a system of economic imperialism, a form of global governance that privatized public goods, subordinated local economies to market logics, and deepened dependence on Western capital. The IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs imposed austerity and privatization, transforming a form of embedded liberalism, which once balanced markets with domestic welfare, into a now neoliberal type of orthodoxy. Critical and post-colonial scholars, I would argue, rightfully called these institutions predatory, arguing that they reproduced colonial hierarchies under a simple guise of cooperation. And yet, these critiques, or despite these critiques, many on the center and on the left as well, have come to see liberal institutions as indispensable. For all of the contradictions, they remain the only global mechanisms capable of coordinating aid, responding to things like pandemics, and addressing transnational crises. Their defenders acknowledge that they're imperfect, sometimes exploitative, but argue that they have nonetheless delivered measurable gains in health, education, poverty reduction, and more. So in a world without alternatives, they represent, they being liberal institutions, both a problem and a means of survival at the same time. To make sense of this, I'll return to Immanuel Kant, a philosopher often credited with laying the moral and institutional foundations of international liberalism. As mentioned earlier, Kant imagined that a stable, lawful order could emerge not from moral virtue, like wanting to be good, but from reason, thinking about being good. In that simple claim lies the core of the liberal project, a political system that requires no goodness, only reason, no moral citizens, only rational actors. The liberal international order was built in precisely this image. Institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF were designed to manage relations among self-interested states through rules, incentives, and procedures, rather than through ethical commitments. Cooperation, it was thought, could be engineered, not through solidarity, but through self-interest, disciplined and quelled by law. Yet this moral emptiness also has consequences. These institutions were never neutral. The IMF and the World Bank in particular extended market liberalism into a decolonizing world, treating every village in Africa or Asia as a latent site of entrepreneurship rather than a political community. Structural adjustment, privatization, and debt converted public goods into commodities and reoriented entire economies towards extraction. What was promised as development too often became a system where progress was measured by integration into global capitalism, rather than justice or the well-being of people. From this perspective, the liberal order was not moral, it was managerial. It kept the machinery of global capitalism running, even as it claimed to alleviate its worst effects. And yet, paradoxically, these same institutions have, like I said, saved lives, eradicated disease, sometimes stabilized economies, funded education. And so we can say, yes, they are predatory institutions. Yes, they are productive. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And now, as illiberal leaders move to destroy them, those who once criticized them most harshly find themselves in kind of a really awkward position. right? This is a pretty significant moral question, I would argue. On paper, it looks like, from the left at least, we should let these institutions collapse and allow nations to reclaim economic sovereignty and finally decolonize from international control. But to do so would come at an immense human cost. It would mean real suffering for those whose livelihoods depend on global aid and cooperation, however imperfect it might be. So the question becomes, is it moral to let a system burn if people are trapped inside the fire? Would we be choosing justice or simply cruelty by another name? This dilemma exposes the deeper weakness of liberalism itself. Immanuel Kant's faith that reason alone could sustain order ignored the necessity of a moral impulse, of empathy, solidarity, or generally caring. Liberalism constructed rational states, but not moral ones. Cooperative systems, but not compassionate ones. It built, as Kant foresaw, a society of devils that are just bound by rules, not a community of moral agents bound by responsibility. And so we're left asking whether it's possible to reimagine liberalism not as the rational management of self-interest, but as a politics grounded in what Immanuel Kant called himself hospitality, a moral duty to treat people not as enemies, but as someone entitled to dignity and care simply by virtue of shared humanity. So I ask, could a reformed international order be built not only on rational cooperation, but on a genuine ethic of hospitality, if we want to keep it liberal? Could institutions be oriented towards solidarity rather than mere stability? I don't have an answer for you. But I believe that the survival of the liberal order will depend not necessarily on defending its structures against authoritarianism, but on transforming its very foundations. If we continue to reproduce Kant's nation of devils, rational and calculating and self-interested, we simply preserve a world order without justice. But if we can learn to ground politics in care, to recognize that global governance is not only about efficiency, but also empathy, then perhaps liberal institutions can evolve beyond what they are now, beyond the narrow moral emptiness that created them. That is the task before us. To defend what must be defended, we must also demand that reason finally be joined with justice, that law and cooperation be guided by care, and that the world we sustain is, in the end, not exploitative. Thanks.
Yeah, I would just read it out for you.
That was spontaneous clapping that was coming out, though. You know, this is great. Thank you very much, and thanks for having us and for pulling this together, folks in the Mulroney Center, and Nancy for your leadership on this as well. I'm going to read something which is very rare for me. Normally I just talk off the top of my head, but I want to say some controversial stuff, and so I want to make sure that I actually say what I meant to say. But before I do that, I'm going to return to the tree. So in my analogy of the tree, I'm thinking about the contest that's going on right now on the top of Hunter's Mountain, where Mi'kmaq activists have encamped and are challenging not only what's happening ecologically on our land, but are challenging the very foundation of colonialism in this land and the treaties that are supposed to be guiding how we all live together here. And they're doing that by centering the needs of the land, the animals, and saying, hey, guess what? Somebody has to speak for these folks because they can't speak for themselves. And so we're going to do it. We're going to show up, and we are going to challenge the monoculture of trees that are being consistently planted on that mountain and taking down the hardwoods that are fundamentally important for moose habitat and survival through, hot summers and those type of things. This is something that's being criminalized by our Nova Scotia legislature that rammed through a bill in 5 days that is trying to change the Crown Lands Act and fundamentally undermine the rights of Indigenous people, but all of us on this land to be able to benefit from a rich ecology that is the heritage of this space. So I guess I want to start by saying that, because that's kind of where I want to end, is by reminding us that it's people coming together and challenging some of these systems of oppression, and kind of building on what you're saying, Hailey, in your presentation. But I'm hoping to land it in a bit of an account of some of these efforts, and to give us a little bit of taste of that. But I'm going to first start by giving people a little picture about where development comes from. So, as people have already talked about, development is commonly understood to connect to the story of liberal internationalism through the foundation of the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the UN system, and I would argue not Eisenhower, but Truman, and point 4 of Truman's inaugural speech in 1949, where he made a pitch for US leadership in the post-war period in decolonization and a commitment to help the quote-unquote underdeveloped. This is a term that many people say he coined. There are arguments about that, but in a lot of ways, he popularized it. And in critiquing the legacy of this speech, Gustavo Esteva noted that in one turn of phrase, Truman turned a complex world of still colonized and starting to decolonize peoples into a singular deficient category, underdeveloped, and all of the logics that go with that. This is part of the legacy of liberal internationalism, an application of a largely Euro-American view of the world that is premised on maintaining capitalism led by the US. And let me say that again, capitalism, not a liberal order, but capitalism led by the US, where rules-based approaches are constantly bent to suit the needs of capital as judged by the US. The idea that it promotes democracy or fairness is undermined at every turn, and these contradictions constantly cause problems for US hegemony. And I think we're seeing that right now, especially. The massive contradiction between the way in which Israel and Russia have been treated is a perfect example. Both have acted as aggressors in an unequal conflict. And yet only one of them was immediately hit with sanctions and cancellations and consequences. Now, as the genocide in Gaza continues, this is beginning to change, but certainly not with any speed or seriousness. So while we can certainly look at Trump's approach to international relations and discarding any hint of rules-based approaches, Trump is really just a naked version of what has been the pattern since Truman's speech. I'll give it a quick example, and actually, Asa, you alluded to this. When Salvador Allende was elected democratically in Chile in the early 70s, his socialist leanings became a quick target for the US. And when a coup overthrew his government and put in place an authoritarian military ruler, Pinochet, the US establishment cheered, and not just the establishment in Washington, but in Chicago, where a new idea about this kind of international order, neoliberalism, was being cooked and baked and ready to deliver. And they thought, oh, here's a great opportunity for us to try out our theories and work with this new government with US state backing. This was not a pro-democracy moment, a rules-based moment, but rather an anti-democratic US-led junta that undermined a very vibrant social movement that led to an election of a very popular government. These kinds of contradictions led myself and a colleague at Dow, Ajay Parasram, to join others such as Uma Katari at Manchester, a critical development scholar, to challenge the way in which the origin of development is framed and recenter critical voices who have actually been part of the discussion since at least the post-war period that we're kind of talking about. about how colonialism, the legacy of colonialism can be overcome, the impact of centuries of colonial wars can be addressed, and the legacy of enslavement that continues to be present in our day can start to be addressed. People like Aimé Césaire, Frida Kahlo, Walter Rodney, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Frantz Fanon, these are all folks who called for a system of decolonization that would give those decolonizing a chance to self-define their future. That's a Philip McMichael idea, not to just follow what the European idea of the nation state was, but to actually define what the future would look like. Kwame Nkrumah was especially brilliant in articulating this. Rather than focusing on the kind of internationalism that was designed from the outset to maintain a hierarchy of nations, this internationalism brought folks from across borders to challenge the legacy of colonialism and how it could be ended to create a more equal world. And there's a fantastic book called Insurgent Empire by Priyamvada Gopal that documents this internationalism, how people from both the centers of colonial power as well as those in decolonizing movements were meeting and strategizing together and building a solidarity to make these changes. And this was really an inspiration for the chapter that Ajay and I wrote. And this is where I want to turn to in the last portion of my contribution, to a form of internationalism that has consistently pushed back against authoritarianism, towards honoring humanity, while also acknowledging the legacies of oppression that did and continue to exist. This is an internationalism that responded to Allende's overthrow by building solidarity networks to force governments, and this is really important. I don't actually believe that these institutions change unless people are the ones pushing for those changes. And it was these kinds of solidarity networks that forced governments like Canada to recognize political persecution as a category of refugees that was not there before this organizing. This is also the internationalism of the Summit and the Freedom Flotilla that challenge Israel's occupation and genocidal collective starvation of Gaza by doing everything in their power to get food to people in need. This is also the internationalism of the network that I'm involved in, and Nancy alluded to this in her introduction, working with social movements in South Africa, in Ghana, and Guatemala, and here in Mi'kma'ki. And just recently, we came together in South Africa, and as we came together, one of our colleagues, Leocadio Huracan, was arrested leaving the airport in Guatemala. And he was arrested, why? Because he was organizing Mayan peasant farmers to try to get land that they were promised in the 1996 decision around the genocide in Guatemala, land that they were supposed to be getting back, and they were not getting it back. Well, we came together in South Africa without him. We worked with the conference organizers that we met with there. We built a lot of pressure. We worked with colleagues here in Canada, Breaking the Silence in particular, which is a maritime-based solidarity network. And we put pressure on the Guatemalan government and also on Canadian embassies and US embassies in Guatemala to ensure that, first of all, that he got out on bail, because the prisons in Guatemala are notoriously violent. And secondly, we're working with him to challenge the charges that he faced, these manufactured charges. So I would say, small acts, big acts, coordinated acts, spontaneous acts, these are the things that forced change in international contexts, even if Trump thinks it's him. And I would say they are largely responsible for any moments where liberal internationalism has actually looked good. And I've got a list here of things that I could talk about in questions. And I'm done.
So I'm the last, yeah, and I should better be good. We heard from our historian that there is a history of all these international organizations. Then we heard from a practitioner that, there is a link between the crisis of liberal internationalism and trees, and and some other issues that we should keep in mind, not be diverted by this whole discussion. We heard from our political philosopher, Canadianist / everything else in political science, that liberalism has a history and some roots there as a concept. And we heard that there is a discussion, there is a debate, there is a link between development, decolonialism, and the crisis of liberal internationalism. Is there anything else to add for me? And I would argue, yes. As my distinguished colleagues here in international relations, because this is an international topic, international relations topic in political science, know how much of a friend I am of IR and how much I believe in IR debates. Let me bring it over to my comparative politics point of view and make the argument that maybe we are in a position to talk about the crisis of liberal internationalism because the state actors, the countries that are liberal democracies, and liberal democracy in itself is on retreat these days. Yeah. And this is a bigger topic that political scientists have been explored for the first 20 years. It's established now. We have different labels for it. Yeah, some people are talking about democratic backsliding, which means enough deterioration, enough chipping away from the quality of democracy to make liberal democracies jump down in the category of electoral democracies. And there is this big difference between democracies in the world. Yeah. Once upon a time in my former life, I used to live in a people's democracy, which was more democratic than all of us put together today. Yeah. Communist Romania. Yeah. But many people pretend to be democracies, but not everybody is a democratic or a liberal around. Yeah. The difference between liberal democracies and electoral democracies is that electoral democracies determine, elect their representatives through some kind of free and fair elections. But liberal democracies do that, and on top of it, as Fahid Zaharia has a nice piece. Yeah, he says liberal democracies also uphold the principles of liberalism, and they respect human rights. Yeah. So let me show you something that scholars of democratic backsliding are contemplating for some time now. Yeah. We are going down. Yeah, pretty much when it comes to the number of countries in the world that are classified as liberal democracies, and also the percentage of the population in the world that is living in a liberal democracy. Yeah. So when you have these fewer people committed to liberal principles, yeah, no wonder that maybe not only at the domestic level, but also at the international level, you have a problem of liberalism. Yeah. Again, we've studied democratic backsliding, which is a term that I like more than populism, for example. Yeah. And there is a ton of work on populists. Yeah. And who is a populist? And you have populist on the right and populist on the left. And everybody's a populist in the end. Yeah, I don't like the term because to a certain extent, all politicians have to make appeal to the people, have to pretend to talk in the name of the people. Yeah, I like democratic backsliding because that more carefully curated concept helped us to see one thing. Not only that, the number of countries undergoing democratic backsliding is going up, but now we understand how. Yeah, and the story goes this way: you have not so much democratic guy or girl, more guys than girls, but we have girls too. Yeah, who is using democratic processes and institutions to grab political office. Yeah, and you think of maybe Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Kaczynski evil twins in Poland, and Robert Fico in Slovakia, and my friend Donald Trump south of the border, and my friend Duarte, and my friend Bolsonaro, and my friend. There are friends, all these friends all over the world. Yeah, these undemocratic, autocratic people use democracy and its processes and institutions to grab political office. And then what they do, what they know and what they like, yeah, they use democracy to chip away from democracy, yeah, to chip away from, to aggrandize the powers of the executive, to, you know, put the judges there in a corner, to, take away some rights to this group or that group, yeah. When the autocrat in the executive aligns when it comes to political views, policies, platforms, statements with the parliamentary majority, pretty much you run. Yeah, because that's the situation we have it south of the border. Yeah, this is how they you get the idea from the executive that is turned into law by the legislative. Yeah, that it's made a rule for the people in the country. Yeah, so I don't want to go more into these things. I just want to say, from a comparative politics point of view, broad discussions about the world is this way and not this other way, they sound hollow in a way, yeah, because from where I'm standing, it is a big difference whether the country is a democracy and an authoritarian system. Yeah, I am mildly afraid of the U.S., although I have the conviction that sooner the Americans will kind of wake up. Yeah, I'm not sure I would be so peaceful, yeah, sleeping too peacefully if the gardener of the tree is China, with its record of, Uyghurs and the list that we all know. I would be really, really scared if my friend Putin, who's really very close to the part of the world where I'm coming from, yeah, would be the gardener there. That's really scary. And I would add only one more thing. Because of these differences at the national level that impact what they do at the international level, yeah, it is, and I lost my idea now. it is important to make distinctions between different countries and to recognize the fact that reality in North America, the way we read the world in North America, is not necessarily the way a Latin American would read the world, or an Eastern European would read the world. We heard that the war in Ukraine got more recognition, or more pushback from the West, whatever that is, yeah, compared to the war in Gaza. But some wars, you didn't even hear about them, yeah? How many of you know there is a frozen conflict in Moldova? Not that you really care, or not that you really know where the heck on the map is that, yeah? Where is the interest in Georgia? Russia versus Georgia, Russia versus Moldova, Russia versus North Ossetia, Russia versus Abkhazia, Russia versus South Ossetia. Where is the interest here? There is no news. Yeah, there is no news. Some conflicts are not even on the table here. I'm not saying they should be. Yeah, because what happens in Canada is not on the table for Ukrainians, for example. Believe me, not now, yeah? Or Romanians, for that matter, yeah? There is a distorted lens in every country about the rest of the world. But we should keep in mind this when we kind of, I would say, to ponder, to nuance what we believe about the world, and what that unique solution we think it's called for. Thank you very much.
You've collectively given us a lot to think about, as well as a great analogy about trimming trees or digging them out, or the gardener, who the gardener is. I will also keep that in mind. But I also think this panel and the strength of it collectively is people who have are coming from different disciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives, as well as, and I'm so grateful for Yogesh this evening in terms of being a practitioner of working internationally and all that represents. So thank you to everybody. I'm now going to turn this over to the audience to ask if anyone has a comment or a question.
Professor Cho has something to say.
Well, it's also, can I also say if anyone on the panel wanted to comment on something that someone else said as well, they're welcome to do so.
Ask a question. My question is whether, another topic is the crisis of liberal internationalism and its consequences. Whether you would really think this is a crisis of liberal internationalism or a crisis of hegemony. Specifically referring to the fact that all this soul searching in the last few years stems mostly from the reemergence of Trumpism, and whether the fundamental root of the so-called crisis of liberal internationalism is not so much about the legitimacy of liberal internationalism or even the liberal international order itself, but the fact that we have what I would describe as a falling and failing hegemony. And if that's the case, then is there really a future for the liberal international order if the underpinning political foundation, basically the United States has been upending its own order? So that would be my question, what your take is.
I told you.
Which I did not intend to ask.
Anybody? Yeah.
All right. I can try. It's a great question, and I think if I heard you correctly, if US is pulling out, or if you look at it from the US's perspective, this is a crisis for their hegemonic power, right? So from that point of view, yes, they will look at it as a crisis for their loss of their power. But if they pull out, then this whole international liberal order becomes orphan, because they were the ones who created it. So to replace that, what do we have? So what I talked about, now increasingly people talk about this multipolar world. It's not like something out there. It's actually happening, and I talked about the GDP numbers, the economic share of the countries in the global south and different configuration. But if you look at the different trends in terms of technology, you look at where China is, where India is, you look at the sectors of the future, green economy, for example. Look at where all the solar is being produced at the moment. Electrical vehicles, batteries. These are the sectors of the future, and those countries are actually leading it. And they are creating their own place. So they will be part of this new order, because they in their own right, they have the demographic on their side, that all the young people with the technology, they have aspirations, and it's not necessarily, I would say, it's anti-West, it's non-West, and they want to create their own space. So that's what I would say. So if you look at it from the US point of view, definitely it's a crisis to their hegemony.
John?
So I think it's important when we talk about hegemony that we recognize there are two sides of maintaining a hegemony. There's trying to manufacture consent, and then there's also using violence to impose consent. And I think that as we talk about, failing hegemony, I think that we're actually seeing a turning to violence as a form of maintaining hegemony that's happening. And that's deeply worrying for all sorts of reasons. But I also think that in these cracks are the places where counter-hegemonies can start to emerge, where, and this is why I was talking about other kinds of internationalism that have been here and have been working for a long time. And I think that they connect with the kinds of things that you're mentioning, Yogesh, and the possibility of new hegemonies starting to emerge as these others, start to shift into being a much more naked version of hegemony. The question becomes the way that happens. To me, is really, are we looking at a period of violence that's already happening on the streets in Chicago right now, and in Portland, and that's spreading to other places? I hope that we can find and we can amplify the kinds of counter hegemonies that are already in place and that are already working, and push those into this space, as opposed to expecting the return of a U.S. hegemonic order that's benign.
Okay.
If I could,
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it's fine. I would just say, I think in terms of your question, there's an obvious overlap between the creation of the liberal international order and the creation of a U.S.-dominated international order since 1945. I don't know if they're, you could separate one from the other, but I think the interesting aspect of the liberal international order is there are plenty of other countries who are willing to support the liberal international order. And so as the United States seems to be departing from the world stage, I guess the stage is set for other countries to perhaps pick up the ball, if you like. I'm mixing my metaphors between stages and games, I guess, whatever I'm doing. But and I just don't know if to what extent that will happen. So for just a Canadian example, Chrystia Freeland in 2017, when she was our foreign minister, talked a lot about the decline of the rules-based international order. She lamented that the United States was pulling back, said Canada had to do more with its allies, and then promptly the federal budget for the Global Affairs Canada was slashed, our defense budget was slashed, our development spending was slashed. Mr. Carney and his government have talked about Canada partnering with liberal-minded countries to support the international institutions as the United States retrenches, and where I think we're about to see an austerity budget. From what I've learned from my friends in Global Affairs Canada, they're going to have a $1.1 billion budget cut. So we're not picking up the ball, and I think when we see other liberal international countries that support the liberal international order in Europe in particular, but elsewhere as well, I think they're not willing to fill the void in the same way. And when we see the dark clouds on the horizon, if I can really put another metaphor into play, when we see the democratic backsliders, particularly in European countries, we might be looking at a world in 2 or 3 years in which there are lots of countries really turning inward. If the Reform Party, for instance, dominates British elections, I can't imagine Nigel Farage pumping in huge amounts of money into the United Nations, into development spending, etc. When he clearly wants to, he's a little Englander of the to the nth degree. So I don't know if other countries are going to pick up countries that have traditionally supported the liberal international order are going to pick up the ball, which leaves the stage open, to go back to that metaphor, to the BRICS countries. And I'm not sure if, I personally don't want to live in a world in which many of those BRICS plus countries have the whip hand of the liberal international order, because I don't think they'll support it. And I think their worldview in many of those countries is fundamentally opposed to the kinds of things that I think, for all its faults, the liberal international order has supported. That's a secondary question, perhaps.
Thank you very much for this panel. I find it really interesting, and the different perspectives are absolutely fantastic here. I'm just wondering, don't you have the impression that we are trapped intellectually with the idea of liberal internationalism? That let's say that there existed some kind of ideal that Asa was referring to, and then as we went forward, we were just see a certain deterioration of this idea. And the things that, and I appreciate John's change of perspective, speaking of, that the focus was capitalism, not necessarily liberalism. And we are also, as an institution, we are used to the idea of liberal internationalism, but is it working at all? There are different strategies that are working, and I was thinking about it from a point of view of a teaching institution, also how we present it, and I am under the impression that this is a kind of a trap for us to glorify it. And I was just wondering what would be your perspective? Is the same thing, when you mentioned that you lived in a popular democracy. I lived in a socialist country, which was really a communist country. It's just like, is a liberal country really just a capitalist country? And we are kind of participating also as an institution with this idea. So I'm just wondering, what would be your perspective on that? Like, do you think this is an idealization that we should just leave behind and maybe look towards different orders?
I'd say one of the fascinating things I've noticed, and I don't think I'm alone here because I think I've plagiarized this now. I'll plagiarize it from somewhere I picked it up in front of you. But one of the fascinating things about the Trump moment, if you like, or the kind of democratic backsliding moment, is that it's put people who are opposed to the democratic backsliders in the position of defending institutions that they would otherwise be the critics of. And I think John talked about this a little bit, but we could just see this. It's almost better to go with the devil than the devil that's out there. And so we see this in terms of American domestic politics, where progressives and the broader kind of democratic coalition that's opposed to Trumpism is in the position of defending like the FBI, which is not something that I think most progressives would have wanted to do 10 or 15 years ago. But they're now in the position of doing that because it's one of the bulwarks against Trumpism that's clearly in a series of disarray. And so I think we're seeing that at the international order too is that I think for critics of the international order, or some anyway, maybe not many on this panel, would say it's better to go with the institutions we have than a anarchic, my IR friends here, but an anarchic world of naked power in which there are no rules and the strong dominate the weak. I think that's the alternative, perhaps, or maybe there's a nice alternative out there, but I think the historian in me says there's a dark alternative out there, which is that for the majority of human history, the strong have done what they wanted and the weak have suffered what they must. To go back to Thucydides 3,000 years ago, there's wisdom in some of the, I don't know if there's classics professors in the room, probably not, but there we are. I think there's wisdom in some of that sort of thing as a historian, and that's a frightening kind of concept.
Hailey, I think you wanted to
Yeah, I think
contribute to that. Yeah.
thanks for your question, because that's kind of what I was grappling with when I sat down to prepare what I was going to say today was, there's something about liberalism in and of itself that makes me completely unsurprised that we are where we are. And even to go to your question about, is it a crisis with liberal internationalism or with the hegemon? The hegemon is liberal insofar as it uses liberalism to achieve a certain type of might through the market, and I think that now that we see that it has its dominance, it doesn't need all of, like, the nice things from liberalism anymore, and can move away from it. And so even when you had given your tree analogy, and I said, I think the problem is more so that it's the species of the tree, which is that the liberal tree has all sorts of nice things, but it's grounded in being rationally able to choose these things. But rationally, or capacity for reason, also makes us very capable to choose the thing that is easiest or yummiest, or whatever, right? Are the same capacity for reason that has me choose liberal rights it's the same capacity that makes me click yes, keep watching when Netflix asks me if I want to keep watching. It's the same impulse. So it takes and it takes and it takes, and there's nothing within liberalism that stops that impulse. So at this point I'm ranting, but the reason that I'm ranting is that when I wanted to write down what I was going to say, I was like, I don't even know how to conceptualize this, because it's liberalism to me is the problem. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks so much. What an amazing panel tonight. Actually, your last point has really kind of stuck with me. I would say that it's the problem. It's a problem, perhaps, in a field of trees, since we're using the analogy. What concerns me in the discussion is that each of you have touched it. Whether you've talked about humanity, the intrinsic, I think, focus we should be having, the morally right thing we should be having on thinking about how we serve and protect and lift each other up as human beings, as well as the rest of the beings of this earth. But within everything that's been said, I worry that the human rights component of our discussion isn't being fully lifted up. And what I mean by that is whether we're in a disorder or we're in a reordering and we're in the transition point of the reordering, invariably there's going to be a heavy cost. And where that heavy cost is going to come in is going to be on those that are probably the most systemically underrepresented, marginalized, and so on. So within that, I'm concerned, and I just wondered, the extent to which we don't try to protect or uphold a particular version of liberal internationalism, because, as you've well said, it is a problem in and of itself. If we use again the tree analogy, often we talk about low-hanging fruit. And, you know, the idea of liberal internationalism sometimes means that we take the most convenient, as you said, the most tasty, but we don't necessarily go deep enough into the issues at hand. So I'm just wondering if there's any more reflections and you know, even Asa on your treatment of the history, and you know, how certain things were born about from a human rights perspective. You know, what is it going to be? What consequences by letting go of all of that? And I think a section for me, what I'm thinking about is, where does Canada want to position itself? And can we be a lone wolf when so many have pulled away and are moving in a different direction? Can we even try to protect something along those lines, even if we don't label it the way we have in the past? I don't know. That's not making much sense, but.
Did anybody like? I think that what you're asking, Eileen, is that one of the positive elements of liberal internationalism was that the commitment to human rights and global human rights on to some degree, and that is that even possible? You know, is there anything to say? You can still also want to, again, the analogy of the tree. You can uproot the tree and want to save certain aspects of it, and is that something worth saving to the degree that it can be? And especially in terms of Canada, that whole, you know, the notion of what is it that we sleep beside the elephant or something, and with Trump, it just I could think of some other way of expressing that. But yeah, Lavinia.
But you know, let's think of the case of the International Criminal Court, yeah, which was the U.S. signed and then de-signed, unsigned, whatever that means. You know, they want it out, yeah. But then all the nice guys, China, yeah, Russia, all the BRICS and other my friends, yeah, they didn't want an International Criminal Court, yeah, for the very same reasons that the US didn't want an ICC, yeah. You don't want a permanent court of justice that will engage in transitional justice cases, that will look at your record of human rights, yeah. And who came and saved ICC? Canada and the middle range powers. So yes, of course we can do it. We can do it. It's for me, that's one example when you can go against the big players, yeah. But it's the power of the middle range and of determination and of believing that human rights are not, are there to not for you pick and choose, yeah. It's there to stay, yeah. So for me, that's a shining example of international action in spite of the big players, yeah. And what a wonderful, because transitional justice is my field, yeah. What a wonderful institutions we have. Was it difficult to set it up? But of course, I had the two students who wrote theses like, it will disappear tomorrow, and it's too early to celebrate and stuff. It's there to stay. It's there to stay. Yeah. 25 years later, it's there to stay.
I'd say, and this maybe goes back a bit to Wojtek's question. Part of, I think, the appeal of the liberal international to many people across the world is the aspirational aspect of it, that it does call humans to our better nature, that's elements of peace and prosperity are intrinsic to the UN Charter. It's in We the People of the United Nations. It's in the preamble. It's in the UN Charter. Obviously, the Universal Declaration, 1948, is an aspirational document, but both in its emphasis on civil and political rights and economic and social rights. It's an aspirational document that appeals to, and its very nature as both political and civil rights and economic and social rights, to broad spectrum of what constitutes human rights, and obviously the international Bill of Rights that comes out of that, with the covenants and things call to those kind of two prongs of international. So the thing about the liberal international order is it's aspirational. It asks us to do better. It asks us at its better moments to look out for people who are underdeveloped, etc., and maybe the negative connotations that come with that, but also the positive connotations that come with kind of charity to people who have less. So there is that aspiration that I think is better than, again, the alternative of a world where might makes right. And you might say, of course, the liberal international order involved a lot of might making right by certain powers. But there was always the ability to challenge that within the liberal international order as well. And for all I was about to swear, but I won't. But for all the mishegoss of say the Bush administration, Bush #2 administration, it did try to work through the liberal international order. And when it didn't, its hypocrisy was clear, I think, to many people. So because it didn't aspire to living up to the standards. So the liberal international order has that aspirational that also then conditions and exposes the fact when countries don't live up to those aspirations.
Is there one more question? Oh, one more. But Dr. Brown.
And Dr. Brown.
Yeah.
Well, are there questions from students as well? Or some students?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Come
Not
here.
to cut you off, Doug.
Come
but
here.
just-
You next question. Prepare.
The Make America Great Again is of course Trump's is the name of his movement and an ideological slogan in many respects. I recall being at a political science meeting, American political science meeting in September 2017, and I think it was Lake, who was the president of the APSA, and he big IR expert, right? And he couldn't understand how, he says, America has gone back to 1945, as you were saying. It paid the price because the dividends were enormous. And so here's my question for the panel is Trump blind to the remaining dividends that America could make? I mean, what happens if the US dollar ceases being the world's currency? Default currency. I mean, does Trump even begin to realize the losses, the further losses, or is this really, in the long historical run of it, is he remaking a world order that is actually going to be better for the United States of America? All of which makes me just totally shiver being a Canadian, because of course if anybody committed to the liberal world order, as the charter member and friend of the United States, it was us. So, we're screwed.
Hailey? Answer.
First.
No, I'm not. You go.
I can make a little contribution.
Yeah, of course.
So, if you really look at the actions, and it's hard, this unpredictability, right? Uncertainty. So you can't be sure what is coming out. But if you really look at some of the actions, so going back to your dollar example, okay, so those BRICS countries had proposed that by 2030, they will have their own currency. And Washington took note of that. Donald Trump took note of that. And now what he's saying that he's going to impose additional penalty on those countries, on those 11 countries, if they do that. You also look at his other actions in terms of from the US perspective. So the war he stopped between DRC and Rwanda, if you go behind it, was all the minerals that he wants to get. Same argument he's making for Ukraine, right? So I think that he was a builder, right? So that economic mindset, even at the United Nations, he talked about how he didn't get the contract to build that building. So from that point of view, there are some actions if you look at what is actually happening. But again, there's so much uncertainty, unpredictability, and things may change in 3 years. 3 years, a little more than that.
He might die.
Yeah, but then we have Vance, so that's not any better. I would humbly offer. I'm just yes, Any other questions?
Camila,
Did you want to ask a question?
yeah.
I
A
think-
question from the student.
Do you really want to ask a question or? Okay, that
The
would be
Brazilian-
great if
The
I know.
Brazilian
Yeah.
perspective.
Okay. Are you from Brazil?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Hi. I don't think my question is going to be as good as the doctors and professors in this room.
Probably
I'm just
better.
a
He'll
little-
be better. Don't worry. He'll be better.
I'm just a girl. Anyways,
I'm
my
laughing
question
because I
is,
know you.
do you think the youth from nowadays is going to change this path, or it's going to collaborate to keep going through this way? Do you think they are striving for the democratic backsliding and they are doing a revolution and it's going to keep like that? Or do you think at some point the youth now that is rebelling against states like in Nepal or like in other countries, do you think at some point they're going to settle down and go back to liberal democracies?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that in many ways, what I was talking about was youth-led efforts, and I think it connects with some of what Yogesh was talking about in terms of the way in which demographics have shifted, and you know, there's technology and innovation that's coming out of youth-led entrepreneurial efforts. My my real interest is in how these movements are defying the notion of the sovereign state. And I think that they are pushing back on this idea that we have to be one country, or we have to be one particular, group, and instead seeing a way that they are able to come together and challenge things like climate change, challenge things like Israel's behavior when governments are completely failing to do this work. They're showing up. They're not saying, are we allowed to do this? They're doing it. So I guess that's where I would end, and that's part of why I wanted to share what I did, because I think it's important to recognize not a vain hope, not a naive hope, but an actual process that's happening, that hundreds of thousands of young people are organizing and have been organizing, even when their universities go after them for things like pro-Palestinian stances. They still show up in their comfortable little enclaves. They're still showing up at getting risks of getting expelled, or even, being deported if they're international students. People are taking those risks because they want to see change and they're willing to do the work, right? And so that's, I think, what gives me hope. And in what I see consistently is a different kind of internationalism in that work. It's not about I am this, I am that. It's more about what needs to change and how do I get involved to make that happen. So that's where I would, that's how I would answer that.
If I could offer a cynical take just as an historian, I would say there's plenty of people, I think, who aspire to that view. That's a very inspirational sort of thing. That's what I would hope for. But there's also plenty of young people, I think, who are turning rightward. There are plenty of young people who are nationalists. There are plenty of young people who want an autocrat. There are plenty of young people who see the rules-based international order and globalization, the movement of people and borders and ideas and goods across the world as fundamentally bad things. There are plenty of people, young people, who are willing to vote as democratic backsliders. And so I think that is also and they share the same patterns of activism, the same TikToks, all of these things across borders as well. The anti-globalist movement is in fact a globalist movement, which is one of those kind of ironies. And so I would only pause just to say, there's that young people are not necessarily the 60s radicals, third world, young people in Canada and the United States, wanting to support people being bombed in Vietnam or marching in the street and embargoing Chilean grapes in the 70s or something, right? There's plenty of people who would happily throw communists from the helicopters, and their champion was shot down at a university just a few weeks ago. The people who literally wore Pinochet or Allende was right. Pinochet was right shirts. College campuses. There's plenty of those people as well. And again, the historian in me points out like the Nazi movement was a youth movement. It was not just the Hitler Youth. I'm not talking about the people who were active members of the Nazi Party were people who grew up in the 30s, in the 20s and 30s. Many of them young people who had no hope, and Hitler offered them a solution. So nationalism has an appeal too, unfortunately, and the ugly nationalism, I think. Yeah.
I will give the last word to Yogesh.
So I'll take two things. I actually did my internship at the United Nations when I was young. When I was doing my master's at Columbia, I did. And Kofi Annan was the Secretary General then, and he used to talk about these problems without passports, like climate change, human rights, migration.
Oh, that's a great expression.
And now if you hear the youth, and I agree with you, there's some absolutely those trends you're seeing, but also now the examples John was giving, that they are concerned about these bigger issues, which actually are these problems without passports of climate, about migration, and they want to they want to build, because with technology, they have seen the better world out there. They have aspirations, and they want to make a world like where human beings and their improvement is there. And just one more thing, and going back to the UN and my time there, and we're talking about alternatives to this global or liberal international order. So there was one, I forgot his name, there was one Secretary General, and during the time of the 50 years of the United Nations, people asked him that this institution needs to reform, needs to change, or maybe we need to look at a new order, new system. So he replied that, I am reminded of a story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And he says that Adam and Eve, and Adam feels as if Eve is getting a bit indifferent to him. So he asks Eve, is there somebody else? Unfortunately not.
It's just another question for Dr. McKercher. Do you think the crisis of liberal internationalism is what is causing the polarization of the youth, both towards the left and both towards the right?
Gosh, what a big question to end on. Partly, I think. Also, I think just a globalized economy that doesn't necessarily seem to work for many people, I think. We could tie in neoliberalism and austerity cuts and all kinds of things as well to that sort of situation. Yeah. But it's a very quick thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. What a great panel.
We thank Jim and Dr. Zuschlag as well for their administrative efforts. Thank you, Dr. Zuschlag. Thank you, Jim.
Yes. I was going to do that. It's okay. I was getting around to it. No. It was a great panel, great discussion, and amazingly well organized. So thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening. And I feel both really pessimistic and a bit optimistic.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.